Okay, welcome to this session on pubs. It was suggested, or I think Neil suggested, actually having this in the pub, but unfortunately that was ruled out of order, so we're having it here instead. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. My name's Peter Smith. I'm wearing 3 hats for this session. My first hat is that I'm on the Battle of Ideas Committee. I helped Claire Fox and her team organise the festival. My second hat is that I'm the Director of Tourism at St Mary's University College. And as part of the curriculum I teach, I actually teach a module looking at the emergence of the pub in the 19th century, so that sort of industrial, urbanised pub in the 19th century, which the students seem to quite enjoy. And my third hat is I'm an ex-licensee of a trendy bar in Manchester in a different life many moons ago. The bar was trendy, whether you think I am, that's another matter. But I think anybody who's followed discussion in recent years will be aware of the issue in terms of pubs throughout the UK having difficulties in business and frankly closing down. So it is a British institution of long standing, which I think it would be not too far to say is in a sense of crisis. And at the same time, young people's drinking over the last 10 years, whilst not at a historical low, has certainly been declining year on year. And young people's attitude to drinking has changed very significantly. Yet also at the same time, discussions around drinking are dominated by issues such as binge drinking, and not only just the young, for those of us that may be called middle class, sitting at home with a bottle of wine, the discussion extends to how much wine we drink when we're at home. So we want to look at all of these issues, but with a particular emphasis on the pub. I'll introduce my panel very quickly, and then we'll get the ball rolling. First to speak will be Neil Davenport, who's organised this session. He's the head of sociology at the JFS Sixth Form Centre. He's a writer and contributor to Spite, amongst other publications. I'll declare my impartiality, or my partiality. He's also a good drinking friend of mine. Okay. Second to speak is Chris Hackley. Chris is Professor of Marketing at the Royal Holloway, University of London, and a researcher into alcohol policy. Third to speak is Dr. Mark Halewood, lecturer in British History at St Hilda's College, University of Oxford, co-founder of the Warwick Drinking Studies Network, which sounds quite interesting, author of Ale Houses and Good Fellowship in Early Modern England, which will be slightly off the curriculum for my students, but nonetheless perhaps I should add that to the reading list. And then finally, fourthly, Christine Thompson, who's the Manager, UK Government Relations for Sab Miller. And I'd just like to thank Sab Miller, not only for Christine being here today, but also for the much wider sponsorship for the Battle of Ideas going back a number of years now. Providers of the drinks last night, which I'm sure you all had a chance to sample, but also for their continued support of the idea and of the Battle of Ideas, certainly over the last few years. It is very much appreciated. So could we first thank our panel, and then I'll let them say their pieces. Okay, Neil.
Thanks, Pete. I think for over a decade, well, even longer, 15 years or so, really, legislators have been determined to transform the drinking habits of Britain. It's almost they've seen it as their overriding duty to try and transform the drinking habits of Britain, from nicotine wall pubs to continental-style cafes and coffee houses. That was, I think, the vision that Tony Blair and the Labour Party had in the early 2000s, to try and sort of create more continental-style cafe culture, rather than what's sometimes derogatorily known as old man pubs. So I think it's been driven apparently for our own good, to protect ourselves from our own sins. We've had the smoking ban in 2007. In 2003, licensees had to be issued regarding whether pub landlords could put on live music. There's been massive hikes as well on the cost of a pint in recent years. Added to this, the high demand for property in London, it's little wonder that landlords have been quick to sell up, leading to a 10% decline in the amount of pubs open in the last 10 years. Figures released this year indicate that alcohol consumption is declining, and young people in particular seem to be drinking far less than previous generations. From a health point of view, this might be seen as a positive development, but in the social development of young people, I actually think this is very bad news indeed. The caricature of the local pub as a seedy den of amoral behaviour, teeming with violence, has rarely lived up to such a reputation. Moral entrepreneurs seem oblivious to how pubs have acted as a civilising force in local communities and have acted as a way through which young people are socialised into adulthood and adult norms, particularly around socialising and particularly around drinking. Not for nothing was having your first pint in a pub considered to be a rite of passage, maturing from a gawky teen to a confident adult. Even underage drinking, wherein a pub landlord turned a blind eye, was important because a teenager realised quickly that acting like a grown-up was required to be part of this environment. There is a notable trend today whereby young people are boozing spirits at home or in local parks simply because pubs are now too expensive, but that's not the only reason I want to explore today. Away from the moderating influence of older adults, young people's behaviour is more likely to be exaggeratedly drunk and out of control. It also must be said that pubs are an anomaly in the sense they are bastions of adulthood, and for some young people in a culture that is eternally infantilised, this is why they are alienating and are seen as something from a bygone age. So the culture of the infantilised shift in our culture and the way that young people seem to be alienated from adult norms means that the pub seems to be a foreboding environment to be part of. And some of my students have actually admitted that they actually feel slightly put off by the fact that it's such a robustly adult environment. But overall then, pubs are largely places whereby you are still expected to behave in a mature way. Health moralists, I think, are also wrong to equate pubs solely with the purpose of excessive heart and liver damage. Having a drink, rather than just drinking, is essentially a social act based around, above all else, conversation that is independent of our social status in the outside world. It's why pubs have been recognised as the great social leveller, in the sense that regardless of your background, partaking in a conversation in the pub puts you on the same level as somebody else. In the late 1930s, a mass observation report by Tom Harrison, called The Pub and the People, noted that the pub is the only kind of public building used by large numbers of ordinary people where their thoughts and actions are not being in some way arranged for them. In the other kinds of public building, they are the audiences, watchers of political, religious, dramatic, cinematic, institutional or athletic spectacles. But within the four walls of the pub, once a man has bought or been bought his glass of beer, he has entered an environment in which he is a participator rather than a spectator. I think the idea of participation is crucial to understanding what pubs and locals in particular are all about, why people are attracted to them, and why they endure as a focus for social networks, even for today. The special features of the local, the layout, the decor, the music, the games, the etiquette and rituals, and of course the drinking, are all designed to promote positive social interaction, reciprocity and sharing. But it is precisely the organic, informal rules that are unique to local pubs and the way that a landlord, rather than the state agencies, has control over a snug or lounge. This seems to be an affront to hyper-regulatory politicians. It's precisely because they are such informal spaces that in an age which is deeply suspicious of informal spaces and informal communications and connections with people, that there's an overzealous demand to rein that in. So, to sum up on, to finish on, I think the war on pubs is part and parcel of the broader hostility towards adults acting like independent actors in society, and the pub has bore the brunt of that hostility towards informal networks.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Chris?
I'm going to argue that arresting the decline of the pub should be an element of alcohol policy in the UK. This is why. In 1974, beer drinking was joyless. Drinking in the pub was a way of being constructively miserable. A man's first pint of bitter beer in a real pub was a profound and solemn occasion in his rite of passage into adulthood. The solemnity marked the drinker as someone who was leaving childish things behind, and the taste for bitter beer had to be acquired. And this was a task to be accomplished, as was getting served in the pub by a kindly barman when you were just 14 or 15. Beer advertising on TV in the 1970s sometimes had funny jokes or silly jokes, but these merely served to heighten the sense of the deep seriousness of male beer drinking. The pub located drinking in a designated time and space, marked alcohol out as a special commodity culturally and chemically, and bracketed drinking away as an adult consumption activity that was set apart from the activities and interests of children. By the time my own sons had begun drinking, its meaning had changed utterly. It was no longer serious or miserable. Drinking had become fun. In fact, it had become compulsory fun. Drinking became fun in 1985. It's probably my phone, isn't it?
Yes.
Which I can't do without at the moment. Okay. Drinking became fun in 1985 when an advertising man called John Webster used a short actor in a bear suit to popularise Hofmeister Lager. This blazed a trail for the use of childlike imagery and themes in alcohol advertising. A commercially driven semiotic makeover superimposed the childish idea of whimsical fun onto the dour notion of male beer drinking. Alcohol branding and advertising started to feature colourful characters, animations and themes of sport, pop music, youth, adventure and adolescent hijinks. For my sons and their friends, alcohol is no less a rite of passage than it was for me, but the meaning of drinking is no longer anchored by the institution of the pub, and instead alcohol has become the fuel for a transgressive 24/7 carnival that's conducted in parks, in streets, in fields and under canal bridges, away from the moderating influence of adult drinkers. I should add that Neil and I arrived at our talks completely independently. We've just stolen some of his phrases. Even when they turn 18 and can use their own ID instead of a borrowed one, many young people start drinking at home and move on to all-night clubs via vertical drinking venues designed for speed and volume of consumption. No longer is alcohol an acquired taste. Lager, mixer drinks and ciders have seen to that. The purpose of drinking for many youngsters is not to show that they've acquired an adult appreciation of and respect for alcohol, but to get drunk and act silly, to win the approval not of adults, but of peers. The changed cultural symbolism around drinking has the unintended effect of neutralising anti-drinking policy measures. Invocations to drink sensibly or to stay within measured units have no resonance for young or indeed for many older drinkers. For the young, drinking's transgressive frisson is enhanced, not reduced, by official condemnation of excessive drinking. Excessive drinking is the only drinking that makes sense to them. Policymakers talk glibly about changing the UK's drinking culture. The truth is that drinking has been stripped of its cultural meaning by the shift to off-sales, by the liberalisation of licensing hours, by the infantilisation of alcohol marketing, and by the grocerisation of alcohol retail, leaving drinking as a semiotic playground for brand marketers. Pubs were once a fixed point around which Britain's alcohol culture turned, not necessarily in edifying ways, but in ineluctably adult ones. Britain's problems with alcohol were bound up with the decline of pubs, and the revival of proper pubs could be part of the solution. So to conclude, I'll suggest that by addressing the incongruities of tied arrangements and beer taxation and rolling back licensing liberalisation, possibly supported by controls on the sponsorship and the marketing that drive sales off licensed premises and give alcohol brands such a vivid cultural presence, policymakers could slow the decline of an important part of Britain's architectural and social culture, and to boot promote the pub and other licensed premises as an underrated civilising influence in Britain's drinking culture.
Okay, thank you. Mark.
Okay. Well, I wanted to bring some historical perspective to bear on this issue of the decline of the pub. I think there's a tendency to often see the pub as a timeless institution that's only recently seen changes in its role in English society, but this, of course, isn't the case. The pub has had fluctuating fortunes across many centuries, both in terms of the relative numbers of pubs and the role that it's played in society. So, for example, in a period I'm particularly interested, between the middle of the 1500s and the middle of the 1600s, the number of pubs in English society doubled. So this was a period when the pub really came to take on a central role for the first time. But in the 18th century, in the 1700s, with the emergence of new intoxicants such as gin, coffee and tea, all of these provided competition to beer drinking, and indeed the importance of the pub declined relative to what it had been earlier. But then, of course, we had the period of the Industrial Revolution, and as Peter referred to, the emergence of the classic urban pub of the 19th century. especially in industrial towns. So there's a trajectory in which the pub has been more or less important at different phases of English history. It's not necessarily a timeless process and then a sudden decline more recently. Nor do I think that the changing fortunes of English pubs are all about regulation. I think that if we look at the 1600s, for instance, it's a period of particularly fierce regulation of drinking, what we might call hyper-regulation in Neil's terms. The government in the early 17th century tried to introduce a 1-hour time limit on drinking. Nobody was allowed to spend more than an hour in their local pub at one time. Drunkenness was made a criminal offence for the first time. And a 9 p.m. closing time was introduced for alehouses. So the government there had a very clear and novel regulatory agenda. It was completely ineffective, of course. These laws were unenforceable, and the government eventually gave up on trying to enforce them. But the pub then had a decline of importance after the government had tried this serious regulatory campaign. So the fortunes of pubs have not actually very often mapped onto what governments have tried to do to change the fortunes of the importance of pubs. It's not to say that regulation doesn't play some part, but I think it's much smaller than a lot of contemporary language suggests, the idea that the pubs are being regulated out of existence. If the smoking ban was lifted and beer duty was slashed dramatically, I don't think you'd suddenly see 50 pubs every week, new pubs opening their doors every week. This is because I think there are more important factors that are driving the changing fortunes of the pub. Part of this is consumer preferences. I think we live in a new age of domesticity, if you like. In the past, a major pull of going to the pub was the fact that the pub could offer a fire, it could offer soft furnishings, until relatively recently many English homes for a long period of time have been relatively cold and damp places. The pub had a certain appeal, a domesticity of its own, which is less important now that we all live that many people have higher standards of living, live in more comfortable homes, more entertaining homes with DVD box sets and the iPlayer. So people choosing to drink at home rather than drinking in the pub is not just about cheap supermarket booze, it's partly about the changing role of the home in people's leisure preferences. And I also think that there's a shift here in which husbands and fathers are choosing to spend more time at home with their families rather than necessarily going to spending all their leisure time at the pub. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I think that that's another aspect of the decline of the pub that is overlooked in some. There's an important changing, shifting gender roles here, which isn't necessarily, I think, something to be lamented. But I also think we shouldn't overstate the extent to which pubs are declining. I think they're just assuming a different role in 21st century English society. The popularity of the gastropub is one example. I don't think this is necessarily a break with tradition. In fact, the alehouse initially emerges as a site where people can go for food and drink, for sustenance. It's not meant to be a recreational site in the first instance. So the idea of a pub as somewhere where you go for food and drink, but not necessarily for recreational drinking, isn't a break with tradition necessarily. I think there's still a role for socialising in pubs in English leisure culture, but I think this is perhaps less prevalent. People are socialising in pubs less often than they traditionally did. Part of this is greater health consciousness, I think. And I think pubs also need to diversify to be able to acknowledge the importance of other intoxicants. Coffee, for example, there's lots of caffeine plays a very big part in many of our lives now. And lots of pubs are starting to sell coffee or provide Wi-Fi and provide new and different services to rather than just being sites of male beer drinking. And the pub is no stranger to this multi-functionality. In its history, the range of services it's offered beyond simple recreational drinking has always been important, and the relative balance of different services provided by the pubs has shifted over time. So I think what we're seeing now is simply another shift, that certain services are becoming more important and heavy drinking is perhaps becoming less important. But there's still an important role for the pub in our society. Although it is, I think, a diminished role. The role of the pub is contracting, but I think that's a reconfiguration rather than a decline that's necessarily going to lead to the complete death of the pub. So just to conclude, these thoughts. I think we are living through an age of change for the pub, but we shouldn't necessarily be lamenting its imminent demise. It's changing its role, it's reconfiguring its role. It's done this for centuries, it's done this over a number of years. So I think what we're seeing is simply another phase in the pub adapting the role it plays in our society.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. Okay.
Thanks very much. I'm going to try to give you a perspective on this from a business point of view, and let me start by saying unequivocally that my short answer to the question about that we're debating this afternoon is yes. We should absolutely seek to revive and preserve the pub, and it would be a sad day to see one of Britain's most loved institutions consigned to the scrap heap of history. And I think these posters here just tell us what we really need to know about pubs, and I think that's something that we should aspire to preserving. As you know, I work for SAB Miller, and we're one of the world's largest brewers, and we don't have any breweries here in the UK, and we don't brew British beer. But pubs are incredibly important to us because we sell 68% of our brands in draft and bottle to pubs, bars and restaurants. So it's something that is very important to us, despite the fact that we don't brew and we're not British. They are very important institutions for our product. And having done a quick canvass of work colleagues and friends over the past week, and even chatting to people last night at the reception, what really struck me is the passionate and actually, dare I say, outraged responses along the lines of why would anyone ever suggest we should get rid of the pub? And really I came to the conclusion that it's an emotionally charged issue and people care very, very deeply about British pubs. But there is no doubt, and I think my panellists have really covered all the issues today, that in spite of all the goodwill and emotional attachment, pubs are facing considerable challenges, which I would argue come from social, political, economic and competitive forces. So the big question for pubs going forward is how do they adapt and continue to keep themselves relevant, and how can they be supported and helped to do this? So the first point I want to make, and it's a commercial point, is that everyone has a vested interest in reviving the pub. They make a huge economic contribution to the country. Combined, the brewing and pub industry support almost 1 million jobs in the country, and very significantly, nearly half of these jobs go to 16 to 24-year-olds. And one of the really positive things that happened this year is that the government took a significant step towards helping the industry. The beer duty escalator was abolished, and beer duty was cut for the first time since 1959. And this has really boosted confidence, with 76% of the British Beer and Pub Association's members saying that they are going to increase investment, and 61% saying they will employ more staff. So it's these kind of positive measures that can really, really make a difference. And very recent figures, in fact released last week, suggest that the duty cut will create 10,000 new jobs in the sector. So I think it's really important that these kind of measures actually generate enthusiasm and confidence again in the sector. And overall, it is expected that this year 400 million will be invested in beer and pubs as a result of the government's actions. So let us hope that a long-term duty freeze follows. The second point I want to make, and I think it's been made very eloquently actually already, is that really big challenges remain. The fact is that pubs have operated in a harsh economic climate over recent years, and only 30% of alcohol consumed in the UK is drunk in pubs. So the stark facts are that alcohol consumption in the UK is declining, more people are drinking wine and spirits, and fewer people are drinking beer. And alongside that, lifestyles are changing. Every day, pubs face competition from restaurants, cinemas, and the home, where growing numbers of people are enjoying entertaining, drinking and eating supermarket-prepared meal deals, watching sports events and movies on very sophisticated and large 3D and HD screens. And what you have is a business that is challenged by new market conditions. So the third and last point that I want to make is that the beer and pub industry will have to continue to meet these challenges, because if they don't, the market will change and they will be left behind. So I think the question we ask as a brewer is, how do you make people fall back in love with the pub and with beer? And I'll give you two quick examples. The first is something we've introduced in partnership with the White Horse pub, which is in Parsons Green in West London. During the summer, we teamed up with them to launch one of our most iconic European brands, Pilsner Urquell, in an unfiltered tank form. This process gives the beer a smoother, less bitter taste, as it doesn't go through the same pasteurization process as bottled and barreled beer, so it slightly alters the flavour. And this proved a really popular innovation in Europe when we first introduced it in Czechoslovakia in 1996. There were 12 pubs offering it, and today there are over 700 offering it, and we've expanded that into Slovakia and Austria. So we launched this in London in the summer, and the impact shows that it has similar potential here. In the first week, the White Horse sold 2,473 pints, making this its most successful ever introduction of a new product. And it's these sort of innovations and experiences that will encourage people back to pubs, because ultimately you're talking about consumers and people who have decisions and choices to make about where they want to spend their money, and it's the challenge to pubs to give them the choices and experiences that they want. And secondly, there's a new campaign, some of you may have seen it, called Let There Be Beer, which has been launched to encourage and remind people what's great about beer. The campaign is aimed to reignite Britain's love affair with beer and celebrate the very best of British brewing. What makes this campaign unique is that it is backed by some of the world's biggest brewers, as well as the national UK brewers, publicans and retailers, and it has the full support from organisations such as the British Beer and Pub Association, the Campaign for Real Ale, and the Society of Independent Brewers. So in closing, I would argue that 2013 represents a potential turning point for the beer and pub industry. There's a lot to be positive about, and I would suggest that the pint glass is half full rather than half empty.
Nice conclusion, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to go to our panelists just very quickly, just a couple of points to get the discussion going before going out to the floor, as I'm sure you've got many things to say. Just one thing I did want to say right at the beginning, and this is no at all directed at SAB Miller. It's very difficult to get anybody from industry to come and say, you know, people should drink as much as they want and, you know, make as much profits as they want. But the flip side is it's also very difficult to get anybody to come onto a panel to say that people shouldn't drink. Or even to admit that people don't get drunk or shouldn't get drunk in the process of drinking. So that's just to couch the way that often I think this debate has moved on to slightly different territory than it perhaps would have done before around sort of prohibition and fully marketing beer. But I'd like to ask a very short question to each of the speakers. And first, it's Neil. I mean, is this just a change of lifestyle or a change in consumption patterns that tend to influence younger people as society shifts? Is it really as simple as that in your eyes?
There's a range of different influences on what consumption patterns have taken. It's not so much lifestyle, but it's more the case that the normative behaviour that young people are being socialised in seems to gravitate away from adulthood and adult expectations of what they should be moving into next. So young people don't have that desire to go to pubs in the same way perhaps we would when we were 15 or 16. And I think if there is a change, I don't think it's much lifestyle. It's more the case that young people are being socialised into a normative behaviour whereby they would be suspicious of very old forms of an adult environment. I think that's one of the main things that's changed. And as I said in my introduction, students I've spoken to and I'm curious about this is that they don't go to pubs precisely because there's adults there. Not because they necessarily feel drinking alongside creepy adults or anything like that, but it's more of it's not for them. They want to avoid being in that scenario, being in a sort of grown-up, mature environment. In other words, they want to have a more immature environment where they can still act in an adolescent way, I think.
Okay, I'm Chris, you seem to be of the view that the pub actually provides that space for people to work out, I suppose, drinking in a healthy manner, or at least in a moderate manner. Do you think that ideally for you, is that the sole purpose of the pub, or is the pub got multi-purposes, or is that what you think is the danger of the decline of the pub, the inability to provide a space, physical and what have you, for young people to explore alcohol? Is that the issue for you?
I think the shame, the pity of it is. Can I move
Sorry,
the pity of it is that the pub is no longer the first thing that springs to mind for young people when they think of alcohol. Partly because it's very easy to get it from elsewhere. It's no longer the pub barman is no longer the gatekeeper to access for alcohol for young people. And this has really shifted the emphasis away from all the rituals and all the putative moderating effects of learning to drink in an adult environment, and created a completely different association of meanings around alcohol for young people who learn their drinking down the park with cider and alcohol pops, you know, without any adults being around at all. So I think the same of it is that the symbolism of drinking in the UK has now proceeded to a point where the pub is no longer really a feature of it at all for most people.
And would you say then that the figures looking at the decline of drinking in young people probably actually underestimate how much young people drink? Oh
yeah, there was a survey out recently which is based on self-reports of school kids, which I think is, you know, I'm hugely sceptical about. My own observations of my own son's drinking suggest that whilst it may no longer be binge Britain in the way it was 10 years ago, but the patterns of drinking are very, very deeply ingrained and extremely persistent, possibly among certain demographics. But nevertheless, that certainly persists. And for many young people, drinking now is something to be done to an extreme, but perhaps once a week, once a fortnight. And in between that, they don't drink for the sake of enjoying it.
So changing consumption patterns in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
Okay. Mark, you very. I liked the sort of overview of the ale house and then the pub and what have you, and the changing role of the pub. Are you essentially saying there is no real crisis? It's just a change now of role, and pubs will adapt?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, I think, like I said, I think the role of the pub is contracting, and I think that you know, some of the concerns that have been raised about the implications of that are important things to consider. But I don't think that what we're facing is a kind of crisis in which the pub is imminently about to drop off the landscape of English society and culture. I just think it's coming into play different. We're seeing different types of pubs being popular, seeing different consumer preferences, and the pub has to compete now with a much wider range of alternatives. We've heard with a much wider range of alternative forms of leisure activity, and I think that you know it's a case of the pub reconfiguring what it offers rather than necessarily that it's going to.
Okay. To what extent is that geographical? I mean, in metropolitan London, where you know we all go to gastro pubs and eat fancy food and Costa Coffee next door and all the rest of it, and Wi-Fi'd up, maybe. My old stomping ground, Manchester. There's whole areas of Manchester where historically that was the you know one of the areas, the centre of the pub, completely absent. The pub's closing down at a rate of knots. So is it a class issue? Is it a geographical issue? Are some areas more impacted than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I would emphasise as well. That you will see different. You know, for the nature of a discussion like this, we're tending to kind of homogenise the pub and to saying what's happening, the fortunes of the pub. Of course, there are lots of different types of pubs in some areas. The pubs are particularly healthy. Certain types of pubs are actually expanding, whereas other types of pubs are declining. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there are lots of different types of pubs. But I mean, on the geographical issue, it's not simply a case, I don't think, that you kind of in big urban area or in the south or in London that you've got these sort of trendy gastropubs and everywhere else that's in decline. And you go to lots of small Devon villages where supposedly the village pub is completely in decline, and actually lots of very vibrant pubs in small villages still that still play a more traditional role. So we do have to be sensitive to the fact that we're actually talking about lots of different types of pubs.
Okay, great, thank you. And Christine, in terms of I like your campaign, what was it to make people fall back in love with the pub, or fall back in love with beer? Is it the case that people just aren't in love with beer and young people aren't in love with drinking? Is it just a wider social issue?
I think, for the brewing industry that is a very big challenge, and certainly in the UK we've seen over time that the wine and spirits and cider are being consumed much more than beer is, and beer as a sector is in decline. So it is an absolute challenge, and given that is traditionally the main drink of a pub, it does raise issues around consumption, around changing drinking patterns and behaviour. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. You got the mic? Yeah, great. So straight out to the floor. I'll take a few at a time, as we always do at these Institute of Ideas events, and then come back out and let the panel speak. So if I could take the gentleman here.
Thank you, Andy. One of the phrases used early on was the image of the old man pub, and all through we've had young people don't like pubs. Back in the 60s and 70s, we had the fear that real ale was for old men and it was dying out and the demand was for something else. People set up a campaign for real ale, there's now more of it than anything else. We've talked about beers being linked, pubs just being about drinking beer, but is there a need for a campaign for real pubs to put the idea of you can go there and it's not just about drinking beer, it's about having a gin and tonic, it's about meeting people and trying to put the idea that people actually value something about the nature of a pub. When I was a student, and yes, this is now 14, 15 years ago, there was a push to transform a fairly traditional pub in Durham into an It's a Scream because it was thought that's what the kids wanted. Actually, the Students' Union was one of the biggest things saying, no, actually, we like some old pubs, please leave it alone. Would it be possible, perhaps, or desirable, for people to get together and say, actually, this is what we want, and campaign for the regulatory issues that were brought up to reflect that?
Campaign for old man's pubs. I'll join. Gentleman here down the front. And then we'll sort of dot around.
Is this on? Yeah. Great. My name's Ed. I'll explain my drinking habits. I started drinking at the pub when I was about 16 after I was playing darts. I won't mention one because I'm sure there's some undercover police officer who'd love to bloody shut it down. Neil, I recognise a lot of what you said, mainly about the price of land, purely, that it's just the business itself doesn't make enough money now when you can make a hell of a lot more by just selling the land and closing up shop. Also problems on the stupid amount of tax that you have to pay on a pint of beer, and also how there's it's not a fair fight between pubs and other forms like Tesco's, because pubs will have to pay more in terms of cost and they're not allowed to be open as long, whereas nightclubs can be open at whatever time. I would like to say that for me, someone who does drink in a pub, and much prefer them over anything else, they're social institutions as much as anything else, like the local darts team, the bowls team. When I used to coach a kids football team, a lot of our money in terms of charity and support came from the pubs around the corner who thought it was important to invest in their area and give something back. I want to talk just now quickly about how it could change.
Very quickly.
Yeah, I think a lot of pubs, when we talk about the landlord and sell them up, they're not selling them, it's the brewery who owns the land, who the chief executive, who's going to make a killing by selling it off. I think one way in which it should change and can change, I'd like to know your thoughts, is if they're actually cooperatively owned. So they're owned by the people who use them. There's an example in Kingsley and that's just happened now, where it's not owned by a brewery a million miles away who really couldn't give a toss because they'll make money on the property, but it's owned by the members themselves, and that way all the benefits to social institutions and the joy of having it, even though it doesn't make a huge killing, but it's vitally important, is always going to be protected because the people who own it are the ones who care about it most.
Okay, thank you. And the lady at the back?
Hi there, I've just got a few points I want to make, so I'll run through them as quickly as I can. Firstly, do we think the rise of chain pubs, and I don't mean pubs being owned by breweries, but your pubs such as your Wetherspoons being everywhere, is killing the atmosphere of the pub per se? I mean, there are benefits. The alcohol there is cheap, they do serve a variety of drinks that you might not find in other places. However, is the atmosphere sort of too artificial? Are we not having that community of knowing the landlord and knowing the regulars? Is it just kind of like a homogenised corporation that's coming in and providing too much consistency as opposed to more character? Another problem could be prices of alcohol fluctuating throughout the country in pubs. I'm from a town in the Midlands, and where I'm from, I'd say alcohol is, prices of beer in pubs are a lot cheaper compared to London, and since moving to London as a student, I've noticed the stark contrast. What I'd be paying for 1 pint here, I might be paying for 2 back home, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a case of I want to buy more of that money and get drunk, but when you want to go to the pub, it's a more expensive venture, and as a student, when you're trying to watch your money, the price of the pint is stopping you going to the pub in the first place sometimes. Another point, young people, I think, are turned off from pubs, not necessarily just because they might feel that the environment is too adult, but they can't even, a lot of pubs now, you can't even sit there and just drink a soft drink with your friends who are drinking, because you know, the person who owns the pub is too afraid that the police are going to come in and kick that person out, or they can be accused of selling drinks to people underage. You know, I do sympathise, I do understand no one is going to want to lose their licences, their livelihood, but at the same time, by saying to people, you know, one day you're 17 and now you're 18 and now it's okay to come to the pub, are we not? You know, surely there should be like a better system of integration so people already in the pub, and then when they're old enough to drink, it's, you know, they're used to that environment already. And
very quickly.
just one last point, cultural differences as well. Since moving into halls, I've also noticed our drinking culture is different, how people in Britain do, from what I see, do want to drink to get drunk, whereas we've got a few people over from Brazil, and I went up to the kitchen the other night and they were all drinking beer, and I said, oh, what are you drinking? And they said, we're drinking to find out what tastes good, so do we need more of, let's drink beer to find out what tastes good, as opposed to let's drink beer just to get pissed.
SAB Miller can help with that. The gentleman there.
Thank you. Yes, my father-in-law was a publican for 30 odd years and died, sadly, 2 or 3 years ago. And at his funeral wake, all his past regulars came back, and we had a good party. And they all said the same thing about him. He was a very traditional pub landlord. They all said he was a second father to them. That as youngsters, whether below age or not, he would serve them and he would keep an eye on them, and he would teach them how to look out for each other, and if they started getting too drunk or whatever, he'd kick them out and make sure someone looked after them. And I suppose the question is, that special intimate relationship that old pub landlords had has now been, you know, significantly altered or destroyed, whichever way you look at it, by regulation. And now, as was pointed out, my son wouldn't go to pubs because of constant harrying and questioning of IDs and so on. The other point is that governments who have introduced these regulations to sort of severely alter the vision of what a pub is are now desperate to try and revive community pubs as, you know, cooperative pubs. And there's I think 3.3 million has been just given last Monday to various support groups. And if you want to set up a community, if you want to buy a community pub, there are loads of organisations tripping over themselves to try and help you explain how to do it. And most of community pubs, if that cooperative trusts, those sorts of pubs, I think with those that I know of, have all run into trouble. You know, a village takes out 300 shares, and then 200 of them, you know, over 2 or 3 years it disappears, and eventually it gets sold on. But the point I'm making is that governments who, you know, recent governments who try to create this continental cafe culture are, you know, the current government is now itself trying to create what it calls a community pub. But I'm a bit worried that it's in the same nostalgic sort of feel of these pub posters, rather than recreating that intimate atmosphere that my father-in-law used to create when he was a pub landlord.
Okay, very interesting, thank you very much. And the gentleman here in the blue striped shirt? And then I'll come back to the panel.
I was a teenager in the 80s, and when I got to the pub when I was 16, and you have 18 as, you'd be conscious of 18 as being a significant age when you'd be old enough to drink, and obviously most of us in here might have well had a drink under the age of 18. And what you have now is a total destruction of young people in Pennsylvania. There's crappy Think 25 schemes which are totally obscene. You know, if you think of what, you know, it says that people, we can't distinguish someone, just because someone might look a bit older than 16, you know, that's how you had a drink in your 60s, you might look a few years older than you were. And now the government think that's a huge problem, so they've got to introduce Think 25 because people are stupid and not too stupid to have any kind of nous, you know, or to even ask the question. So you put this Think 25 7 years above the age to have a drink. I mean, it's ridiculous, and you think what people have done up to the age of 25, you know. So this horrible, you know, there's a lot of pubs in, as well that don't let anyone in under 21, so there's this increasing, you know, everybody talks about the economic side, but there's also the social side where young people being booted out of pubs, and that's been devastating.
Okay, let's just come back to the panel. I don't know who wants to go first. Or... Yeah? Oh. Okay.
All right. I mean, I thought your comment earlier, because I have to acknowledge that I'm no longer a young person and I've entered middle age, and I was interested in what you were saying about your friends from Brazil who were interested in tasting different flavours. And I think it's one of the things, as you can hear, I'm not from the UK, I'm come from South Africa and Zimbabwe, but when I came here, one of the things that really puzzled me about the drinking culture was this intent around going out to get drunk, as opposed to doing what you said your friends from Brazil were doing. And I think, you know, it's such a complex thing, understanding drinking cultures and how you regulate and how, as a business, you react to these type of issues. And I mean, it's something I've lived here for 13 years now, and I still struggle with understanding this intent to go out to get drunk versus just sampling some beers or sampling some wine and enjoying a night of sociability, which is what we say our beer is about. And I find that a very interesting topic, which if anyone can illuminate me further, I'd be delighted to hear.
Don't you just see the pound signs coming in as your friends drinking the pub on a Friday night where you're having a half? No? Okay. Neil?
Well, I think it's useful that people have raised the harassment that young people are getting, particularly the ludicrous Think 25 campaign, which is part of that attempt to infantilise young people more and more, which is sort of deeply problematic. One thing that, I mean, all the regulatory stuff we've talked about, both up here and also on the floor, is true, and it is undeniable if you just look at the figures. In terms of a massive 10,000 pubs have closed within a 10-year period, and it's no coincidence that that took place when, you know, key regulatory measures were being taking place. One thing I think we have missed out in the discussion so far is what the role of the pub has always meant, and that it is an arena for conversation. Above all else, it is a place where you go and have a conversation. So the phrase "to have a drink" doesn't necessarily mean drinking to get drunk. It actually means to have a conversation, and alcohol becomes the lubricant of that process. And I think, and back to your question a bit about it, so I think what happens is that you do get drunk along the way, but it's used as a result of a damn good night out as a process. I think sometimes drinking to get drunk has been exaggerated as a sole purpose. I think the sole purpose is to have conversation and is to have a good time through that. And just to pick up on something that Mark was saying, I think where the pub or watering holes are both timeless and universal is that's the function that they've always played, which is it's a space where adults communicate with each other, are actually away from the domestic home, and a good pub will actually, you know, it focuses you on a conversation. I mean, me and my friends got a phrase called the Sky Sports Pub, which means it will be too noisy and you won't be able to actually have a conversation. So I think that's always for me, being the main hub of the pub. Just picking up on what your woman was saying there about the prices in London, it's true, but pubs in London still survive, and if you actually look at the trend, it's in the provinces, whereby a lot of pubs have been closing down at a rate or not. And I think alongside all the regulatory measures, there's the sort of social factors in terms of the decline of civic life. You know, pubs are not the only institutions whereby they're falling in numbers. Trade union organisations, churches, political parties, all the bastions of where there'd be civic life have also declined. And I think that's had a sort of a knock-on effect as well in terms of what Mark was saying, is shift towards more privatised existence. And so I think for that reason, reviving the pub won't take place through sort of technical quick fix solutions. It's part of a broader trend, the shift away from a sort of more civic culture that we once had in Britain.
Just to pick up on something that Neil just said about the alcohol being a lubricant for social engagement, that still has not gone away. Thinking again of my sons and their circle of friends, for them, getting drunk is something that brings down social barriers. The odd thing for me is that they find it pretty inconceivable to have social fun without that. So how we reached that point, I'm not quite sure. But nonetheless, I mean, just having a drink is not enough to bring down social barriers and create that, you know, sort of leveling effect that drink has. People have to get drunk together to do that. The other thing I'd mention is the young lady mentioned Wetherspoons pubs, which I understand a lot of people feel that they're a little ersatz and not very authentic. But in Banbury, where I live, I had to go to several pubs. Firstly, just when I first went to live there, just to find somewhere that served proper beer. And Wetherspoons is one of them. I've been using that recently, and it's open from 9 o'clock in the morning until very late at night. The people in there, 99% of the people in there are over 55, I guess. It's a wonderful little sort of community centre for people who've got nothing much better to do, so sit there, and people can sit there and read the paper. So I mean, Wetherspoons is Wetherspoons, but to me, it's doing a great job. It's a lovely little pub. You can get steak and chips twice with drinks for 25 quid. I mean, you can't argue with that really. So I just think Wetherspoons isn't, you know, it isn't all a nasty thing. It does a great job.
I tend to agree.
Yeah, I'd echo that as well. I think a few of the Wetherspoons pubs that I've known in towns where I've lived have kind of served to replace working men's clubs to some extent in those sorts of functions of who they're catering to. A couple of things I just wanted to pick up on. One was this idea that we've heard quite a bit about adult drinking being sort of a good moderating influence, and that we need this sort of socialisation of young people to learn to drink like adults. I think there is something in that, but I would also express some scepticism. I mean, maybe it's just the pubs that, that I know locally, but I wouldn't say that adult drinking is inherently always moderate and sensible. And in fact, some of the negative drinking patterns that young people develop, if we think, you know, drinking to excess is a bad thing, are often inherited from local pub cultures in which adults who think they're drinking sensibly may be drinking sensibly for a certain portion of the evening, and then don't necessarily maintain that. So I think, you know, I think we should be a bit more honest about the fact that adults often drink in irresponsible ways as well, and that it's not, you know, it's not that we shouldn't overstate how mature adult drinking is. The other thing I wanted to pick up on was this idea of falling in love with beer again, and I think actually we are. I think that the real ale is a really good example of that. I think craft beers, the emergence of microbreweries, there is this kind of connoisseurial culture increasingly about beer, tasting different types of beers and so on. And I actually think a lot of new pubs tapping into that, are trying to create a kind of a connoisseurial environment in which people can go and drink. And in some ways, though, the smaller breweries and smaller pubs and independent microbreweries are something that people are looking for. And I think that that's I can sort of see why the big brewing companies might worry about people falling out of love with beer, because actually I think where people are falling in love with beer is with smaller independent craft beers, and that's the direction that we're moving.
Okay, interesting. You pinched one of the things I was going to say. I mean, is it just me, but everybody seems to talk about drink to moderation, or you know, adults drink to moderation in the pub and teach younger kids it. No, we don't, do we? Realistically, when we go to the pub, I mean, you know, with apologies for something forgiven. When we go to the pub, we have a fair skinful, do we not? Okay, that's my experience. The worst thing for me is going to the pub to have one drink. It's a complete waste of time. It's expensive for a start. Forget it. You go to have, you know, maybe not to drink to fall over, but you do drink pretty much to a degree of excess. That's what we do, isn't it?
I moved over from the US a couple of years ago, and hello. I moved over from the US a couple of years ago and was fascinated by the pub culture and very enchanted by it, particularly with regards to the conversations that it facilitates. I mean, there's no outlet in the US where you're with people for hours on end, and with being there for hours on end, you end up drinking a lot. And when my family came over to visit for the first time in my life, I was in a pub with my dad drinking, and we were there for hours having conversation, and there's no other outlet for that. However, I think the conundrum sort of comes with, in the US, there's increasing health consciousness and sort of people trying to limit their intake of alcohol. So I think the appeal there is sort of limited. So to your point about there being sort of a constant evolution in pubs, and through different periods of time they offer different things, offer different kind of coffee and just different types of leisure. So in contradiction to your point about we need to fall back in love with beer, in my view that's a bit of a step backwards in terms of where we're moving. But if we move away from beer and move towards something else, pubs offering a greater, array of choices, I mean, how far can we deviate before it loses its charm of being a pub? I think it's a struggle to find something that continues to appeal to the changing demands of society, but maintains the magic that is a pub.
You'd have the campaign for old men's pubs on your back as well. The gentleman there at the top.
Thank you. Really interesting discussion. I agree on the points about the socialising nature of pubs, and also your last point, Pete, that it's not a case of adults kind of sitting there sensibly teaching people how to drink. It's a messy business. It's a more complex and interesting thing than that. But I was a teenager as well in the 80s, and me and my friends and my younger family members, I came from a big old family, the last thing we wanted to do was go to the pub. Certainly the local pub anyway. My older brothers and sisters were my parents and my uncle, but the kind of in the early 80s we just wanted to go clubbing in town in Birmingham and go to the newer places. The people who left school and wanted to go to the pub with the boring ones in their imagination, we saw ourselves as more cosmopolitan. So maybe it's just and I say this to the pub landlord, and I used to run a pub that looked just like that one on the right, and it's bankrupted me. So I won't get that. But what I'm trying to say is maybe there's something, I agree about regulation, but maybe there's something a bit deeper that from the 80s or maybe before then, there's an increasing, creeping fragmentation in society for all kinds of social reasons that means that there isn't anything that really brings people together. I go back home to Birmingham and to the estate where I grew up, and nobody knows each other anymore. The pub's just been demolished. Actually, the pub was really busy with all the kids, and all the kids now that were my age were going down the pub and hanging around with the old timers, and I felt an increasing kind of parochialism, that people didn't have that ambition to get out and move down to London and all of those kind of things. So I agree with what you say, but it's not always that simple. And is there something else, something deeper going on that we can't just put it back together by reviving pubs? Deeper social fragmentation.
No, that's a very good point. Are we relying on pubs to answer much broader social issues that we may be concerned about? It's very good. The lady down the front. I'll take a few ballot ideas, t-shirt wearers, I think would be quite good.
It's very interesting to hear what it looks like in the US. I grew up in Bulgaria, and it's very common there that people start drinking a lot earlier. Not that it's legal, but for example, I got drunk for the first time when I was 13, and with 14 I had like regular drinking evenings, which I'm not too proud of, but this is just how children grow up. And but I was wondering, what about people who are not necessarily interested in drinking? For example, there are many Muslims or people from other religions which are by no means drawn to drinking beer or anything at all. When we are trying to increase the popularity of pubs, do we aim at them as well, or are we only having people who already drink as a target?
There's always cost of coffee. So the gentleman in front of you. Oh, we're going back. Yeah. Sorry, the lady there.
I was just thinking what you said about the It's a Screen pub, and I went to university in Hull, and there was an old man's pub at the top of the road where they actually split it two ways. So one half was It's a Screen, the other half was still the old man's pub, and we always found ourselves in the old man's pub having just sitting there. It was quiet. It didn't have people with these disgusting vodka shop things. This is this is my age. It's about 1995. And so we used to go, and I was trying to think, when was the last time I went to a pub where I sat down, had a nice chat, had some really great beer, talked to people, talked to the landlord, And I was thinking, and I remember, it was a place where we didn't feel like a pariah for bringing in my daughter either. And I remember it was actually in Brussels, it wasn't here at all. I cannot remember the last time I went to a pub here where I felt welcome bringing a kid in, where it didn't have a stupid soft play area around the corner. And I could just sit and it was quiet and I could just have a chat and a nice drink of beer, not some just half a pint of Stella or something. So where are these wonderful pubs? Sheffield. Because I've been to the Market Quarter and it isn't that great. So I do think we need to boost pubs in the UK and beer drinking, because I do love beer, but where are they? These really nice places. Oh, Brussels.
Okay, yeah, Brussels is fantastic.
Yeah,
for drinking. Although I don't like children in pubs, as it happens. But anyway, that's quite fine. So I'm going to see a show of hands, and then we'll come back to the panel. Yeah, a further point there.
Just to answer you, yes, people do go to pub and get drunk, and that isn't necessarily irresponsible, and that isn't necessarily childish. Drinking in an adult way and getting drunk in an adult way is about not being an arsehole when you've had half a dozen pints, and it's about being with your mates and looking after your mate if he is incapable of doing anything else.
Yeah, I'll go along with that. Okay, panellists, would you like to come back? Yeah, good points. Yeah, okay.
Well, I just want to first of all come back to what the gentleman over there sort of fell over with under. I mean, I did say the last time I was speaking that there are, deeper reasons behind this in terms of more privatised society and the decline of civic culture. Pubs were packed when there was more of a civic culture in terms of membership of political parties and trade unions, churches and all the rest of it. So there is a real connection between the two as society has become far more privatised in the absence of a civic culture that people can get behind. I definitely agree with what the gentleman at the front has said here in terms of passing on bad habits, question marks. It's not, I mean, it's true that, adults will get a skinful, but we don't all start sort of throwing chairs around or dancing on tabletops and things like that. That would be completely frowned upon in even the most roughest pub. Anti-pub politicians always going about sort of violence and fights, but I can't remember the last time there was a punch-up or a brawl in a fight. What's been passed on is that you're drunk, but you act sober. Whereas what happens now is that young people are mildly drunk, but they'll act completely stupidly. And I think that's a very different thing. And just going back to Chris's anecdotal point about his son and other teenagers, it's true that a lot of young people can only socialise with alcohol and get drunk, but that's part of the maturing process, which I think is actually very important in terms of what pubs will do. I mean, I recently reviewed a book for Spikes on looking at the clubbing experience in Ibiza, and there were some anecdotal comparisons of what these young people do back at home, and none of them go to pubs. It's full of boring people, that's what they would argue, but what happens is they'll drink half a bottle of vodka and then go straight to a club, throw up, and then their night has been wasted. But the interesting thing is, what they're trying to avoid is that painful process of learning how to socialise with others. And that's one of the biggest hurdles of going from an adolescence to adulthood. And so they'll actually want to avoid that, and instead their night wants to be around experience and doing wild things, rather than actually learning how to have a conversation like an adulthood. And alcohol plays that important role, and also a pub plays that important role of facilitating that maturing process from adolescence into adulthood. One last point, somebody mentioned about local identity. Well, I think you can be ambitious and still identify with the area that you were born in. And I think it's problematic when young people actually don't identify with the area that they're born in, because you end up in a situation, as with the riots 2 years ago, where people would feel, no compulsion of trashing the area that they've been brought up in. There's nothing wrong with identifying the area that you live in. So I think that kind of sort of positive communal bonds, but without being localist or parochial or lacking ambition either.
Okay, thank you.
I remember being a student in 1980 in Manchester, living in a house in Rusholme, which for those of you who know is not a particularly well-to-do area, and there were a lot of pubs around there then, which are fairly gruesome pubs. And I'm thinking that with the point made earlier that pubs are evolving, I think in many ways they are evolving in ways that are not bad things. I loved those pubs. They were very charismatic, And for people like me, they were important places to go into if you dared, and to have some drinks. In those days, that was the beginning of a night out for us. And it didn't really occur to us, and it wasn't particularly widespread, to get a cheap bottle of vodka from the newsagent and begin your evening at home like that. So I think in that sense it was constructive. There is a risk of us being a little bit fanciful about the positive social influence of the pub. But the thing is, pubs have always, they used to have that element of transgression, which is now fulfilled by excessive drinking. And drinking in the UK has always had a transgressive element, in the sense that drinking is a key to a little space, psychologically or physically, that is away from work and away from the strictures of official life, and a space where normal social roles are suspended and people can have a particular rapport and forget about social structure and such. So I think the role of pubs is can be quite nuanced in that way, but it's the fact that the pubs are not necessarily edifying places is not necessarily a bad thing either.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of reflecting on my own drinking experiences, as a number of us I'm sure have been doing. But I mean, when I was before I went to university, I grew up just in a town outside Bristol, and we used to go into town regularly, and we would drink to excess in some of the ways that have been described, and that was kind of part of the idea. We would drink lots of spirits and so on, and that was sort of part of the experience we were interested in. Whereas now I'm very much part of the, I go to the pub with my friends, I drink too much, but we're kind of sensible, and it's generally a positive environment. But I'm thinking, are we creating a bit of a false problem in a sense? Actually, a lot of young people may be involved in this sort of reckless, heavy drinking culture, but then they'll grow out of it. They don't necessarily need to. They don't necessarily need to go to the pub to get to a point where they think, "Hang on, I've had enough of drinking in this manner. It's too much. It's unhealthy. I feel like I'm maturing as an individual. I no longer want to be running around the town centre being sick and kicking bus stops and things like that." So, the proof will be in 20 years' time, those people that we now say are sort of the young people who are drinking irresponsibly and drinking spirits in nightclubs and so on. If those people are still in 20 years' time drinking in these irresponsible ways, then maybe that was because of they're drinking in the club rather than the pub. But I think it's much more likely that in 20 years' time, these young people will in fact be sitting around saying, "I wish there were more old man pubs around." So I'm not sure that this maturation of drinking won't happen anyway.
Okay. The campaign's got a future. Absolutely. Okay, I was just a quick round back to the floor, and then I'll ask the speakers to make some concluding points. The lady here, and then the gentleman at the back, please.
Hi, again reflecting on my own drinking habits. Me and my friends now seem to shift away from pub culture more to that of the cocktail bar. I think one reason for that is it's adventurous. You can always try something new. Do you think pubs maybe just get stuck in the rut, and that they do just tend to offer beer or gin and tonic or wine? That maybe people just want more things to try out to be a bit more adventurous.
Okay, great. And the gentleman at the back, please.
Yeah, I was very interested in this idea someone brought up about multicultural pubs, and obviously people who don't drink, and do they go along? And it doesn't have to be cultural, it can be people to work culture coming for a drink after work, and I think people do that and it's fine, but I think it'd be a mistake to assume that everyone should be welcome in the pub. Everyone should welcome, but you expect everyone who wants to come along. That idea is that it's a kind of national institution. And it seems to me, maybe because we had a session yesterday about the Church of England, that pubs are a bit like the church in the sense of being a declining institution that used to be about everyone at the centre of communities and so on. But perhaps while the Church of England is declining, if you want to look at something like Latin American Pentecostal churches, African churches in parts of London and elsewhere, you see very vibrant churches.